Good afternoon. Can you all hear me all right? Or is it too loud? Too soft? Good. Thank you all for coming. Me and my wife, Sigrid, are very happy to be here. It's kind of like, we did take our vacation time to come here, but man, where else would you rather go? We've never been here to Lake Alaska before, and it's really beautiful country here in North Carolina. My wife said it was monotonously beautiful. Everywhere you go, it's always beautiful. So, anyway, I'm very happy to be here. And talk a little bit about naturalism, Darwinian evolution. Stanley! I've been looking everywhere for this guy. Anyway, so start a little about naturalism, Darwinian evolution, and creation. And my own struggles started, I guess, when I was a child with this. I remember in grade school asking my parents, we have red roses, and we have blue roses, and we have yellow roses, and we have pink roses, and everything in between. And you can start with one, and you can get another one, and we have all these kinds of dogs and cats. And all the dogs started with the wolf, right? And then it went off on these various directions, and you got all these different kinds of dogs. And I was like, why can't you just make these little changes add up more and more until you get everything? That made a lot of sense to me, even as a child. And to be honest, my parents couldn't answer that question to my satisfaction, neither could my teachers. And that's true through grade school, high school, college. I'm sorry. Is it echoing? You can't hear me? A little better? Is there any way to fix the sound system? I don't know how to do it. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. It's like that commercial. Can you hear me now? All right. So even through medical school, I had the same question. If Darwinism is wrong, if natural selection doesn't work, and I believed it didn't, or at least I thought I did through my Adventist upbringing, but I didn't really know why I believed what I believed, and I couldn't explain what was wrong with Darwinian thinking. And so my medical school was paid by the Army, and I did 4 years with military service. And, every other weekend is a holiday in the Army. So I had a fair amount of time to look into this question for myself. And I decided I was going to figure it out. That's like one of us is wrong. Either the Adventist church is wrong, Christianity is wrong on top of it, or popular science is wrong. Both of them can't be right. At least I had figured out that much. And so I decided I'm going to figure this out. And for me, it boiled down to a question in genetics that helped me solve the problem. And we'll get there tomorrow. Today, though, I'd like to start out with why is this important philosophically and religiously? Why are we talking about this even? Who cares? And that's the question today. What does naturalism mean to us as Christians, and especially to us as Seventh-day Adventists? To start out, is science anti-God? And I would propose that modern or popular science is anti-God, but it doesn't have to be. To me, science is one of the languages of God, and we'll develop that as we go along. Darwin's God. Darwin wrote a book published in 1859 on the origin of the species by means of natural selection. There were evolutionary views before Darwin, but Darwin was the first one to put everything together and explain it with a mechanism, and the mechanism he came up with is called natural selection. The rest of the title of the book that you usually don't hear, but which I think is interesting, is called "Or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life." The races there, that word races, includes human races. So he believed... Pardon me? Is that good? As high as I can get? Is that good? That's all right. All right. So it's kind of racist, basically, just to start out with. Darwinism is pretty racist. But what is it based on as far as the mechanism? The mechanism is based on random mutations, which are small or sometimes large, random, non-directed genetic changes. If you don't understand evolution genetically, you really can't understand evolution. That's unfortunate because genetics is difficult. But we'll try to make it fairly simple. It doesn't have to be difficult. Natural selection, it's real. It happens. It's a real brutal force in nature that in each generation mindlessly selects the strongest preferentially to survive and reproduce the next generation. So if you're weak, you either get eaten or killed in some other manner, and you just don't reproduce your kids as good as the next guy who's stronger than you. And so it happens. It's a real brutal force of nature. It's otherwise known as survival of the fittest. And we see it every day all over the place. So what are the implications of this mechanism of Darwinian-style evolution? Well, according to some, like Richard Dawkins, how many have heard of Richard Dawkins? He's like the poster child he's a professor at Oxford. He has an endowment to go and promote the teaching of mainstream evolution and popular science throughout the world. And he gets millions of dollars every year to do this. He writes, although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that if Darwinism fails, if you disprove Darwinism, what happens to atheism? You can't be intellectually fulfilled as an atheist anymore, right? Does that make sense?
The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
What was that?
I know that was probably hard for you all to hear. Let's see if we can get through that without playing it. Okay. If you didn't hear that really well, it's in his book, his latest book, The God Delusion. And he's basically saying the God of the Old Testament is evil. He's a sadistic, malevolent bully. He just likes to go around and kill everybody who doesn't agree with him. And it's basically tell us how you really feel, about God or about Christianity in general. What I find is a lot of these guys who are most adamant against Christianity or Christian thought were once Christian in their views, and they've lost their hope from a Christian perspective. And now they're very adamant against it. The same with this man, William Provine. He writes, naturalistic evolution had clear consequences that Charles Darwin understood perfectly. Number one, no gods worth having exist. I mean, if you believe that God is a murderer who goes around for his own pleasure killing everybody, I mean, who would love a God like that, right? No life after death exists. No ultimate foundation for ethics exists. No ultimate meaning in life exists. And human free will is non-existent. And Darwin understood all of this perfectly. In other words, Darwin lost his hope as well. He died kind of a broken man over his own theory. It's a very hopeless position if you actually accept the implications of Darwinism. And William Provine, he's correct. If you accept naturalism and Darwinism and you go down the road as far as it will take you, this is where you're going to end up. George Gaylord Simpson, he's a professor at Berkeley Paleontology Museum and Comparative Zoology from Harvard. He writes, man is the result of a purposeless and materialistic process that did not have him in mind. He was not planned. He is a state of life, a form of life, a sort of animal, a species on the order of primates, akin or nearly remotely to all life, and indeed to all that is material. In other words, you're not related to God. You're not God's child. You're the result of mindless random chance. It didn't have you in mind. It doesn't care about you. Carl Sagan, famous astronomer and author, he writes, the secrets of evolution are time and death. Time for the slow accumulations of favorable mutations, and death to make room for new species. That's he looks kind of happy about that too, huh? Time and death, yay! Now, what's also interesting about him is he writes later on. He said, "I personally have been captured by the notion of extraterrestrial life, and especially by extraterrestrial intelligence from childhood. It swept me up, and I've been involved in sending spacecraft to nearby planets to look for life in the radio research of extraterrestrial intelligence. So, he wants there to be life somewhere else. He doesn't want us to be alone in the universe. It's also interesting to me that as long as God is not involved in the picture, he doesn't mind there being other intelligences besides human intelligences. Even if we're the origin of another intelligence, that's fine with Carl Sagan, just don't call it God. George Wald, he's a Nobel Prize in Physiology. He wrote The Origin of Life, a famous text. He writes, "Time is the hero of the plot. The time with which we have to deal is on the order of 2 billion years. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible probable, the probable virtually certain. One has only to wait. Time itself performs miracles." Now, is that true? I mean, 2 billion years, that's a lot of time, right? But as I'll explain later on, 2 billion years is a drop in the bucket compared to the time that we really need. 2 billion years really isn't enough time. Dawkins again. It's absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane. Or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that. So, is that true? Everybody who has questions about evolution is either ignorant, stupid, or insane. No one can possibly question evolution without being completely off their rocker. So, I mean, let's just look at this question. Is Dawkins just kind of exaggerating here? Here's a few people who are ignorant, stupid, or insane. Here's Richard Small. He's the winner of the 1996 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. He actually spoke in the keynote address at Tuskegee. "Evolution has just been dealt its death blow. After reading Origins of Life by Rana and Ross, with my background in chemistry and physics, it is clear that evolution could not have occurred." Now, is this guy just ignorant or stupid? Here's Michael Behe. He's fairly famous now because he wrote a book, Darwin's Black Box. He writes, "Molecular evolution is not based on scientific authority. There is no publication in scientific literature, in prestigious journals, specialty journals, or books that describe how molecular evolution of any real complex biochemical system either did occur or even might have occurred. There are assertions that such evolution has occurred, but absolutely none of these are supported by pertinent experiments or calculations." And he's a biochemist. Does he just not know what he's talking about? Did he miss something in his education? Here's Charles Howard Towns. He's a Nobel Prize winner in physics, UC Berkeley professor. He writes, "Intelligent design, as one sees it from a scientific point of view, seems to be quite real. This is a very special universe. It's remarkable that it came out just this way. If the laws of physics weren't just the way they are, we couldn't be here at all. Some scientists argue that, well, there's an enormous number of universes and each one is a little bit different. This one just happened to turn out right." Well, that's a postulate, and it's a pretty fantastic postulate. It assumes that there really are enormous numbers of universes and that the laws could be different for each one of them. The other possibility is that ours was planned, and that's why it came out so special. Now, this guy, he's a professor at Berkeley. He's a Nobel Prize winner in physics. Does he just not know what he's talking about? Fred Hoyle. This guy here, Sir Frederick Hoyle, he's the one who came up with the Big Bang Theory. Anybody know what that? Hear that theory before? This guy, Rick Ramsing, he's a mathematician who's world famous. Both of them together wrote in their book, Evolution from Space, no matter how large the environment one considers, life cannot have had a random beginning. From the beginning of this book, we have emphasized the enormous information content of even the simplest living things. The information within our view cannot be generated. Information cannot, in our view, be generated by what are often called natural processes, as for instance through meteorological or chemical processes. Information was also needed. We have argued that the requisite information came from intelligence. Now, this is the man who came up with the Big Bang Theory. You can't get much more naturalistic than that. Hoyle, in particular, Rick Ramsing goes further in his problems with this. He writes, "It is quite a shock. From my earliest training as a scientist, I was very strongly brainwashed to believe that science cannot be consistent with any kind of deliberate creation." Brainwashed, that's a pretty strong word, huh? That notion has had to be painfully shed. I am quite uncomfortable in the situation, the state of mind I now find myself in, but there is no logical way out of it. So he's forced, against his will, almost, to consider that there might be a higher power. He writes, once we see the probability of life originating at random is so utterly minuscule as to make it absurd, it becomes sensible to think that that the favorable properties of physics on which life depends are in every respect deliberate or created. I now find myself driven to this position by logic. There is no other way in which we can understand the precise ordering of chemicals of life except to invoke creations on a cosmic scale. We were hoping, as scientists, that there would be a ray around our conclusion, but there isn't. They were really wanting there not to be a God, but they just couldn't come to that conclusion. It almost drove them mad to consider that there might be a God. So why is it that there's such a struggle for most scientists to even consider the idea of God or godlike intelligence as being clearly responsible for at least some aspects of our universe and biosystem complexity? So let's get into a little philosophy of why that might be. That's an interesting question. Here's Richard Lewontin. He's a professor of zoology and biology at Harvard. He writes, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. So it's a commitment. It's a philosophical commitment. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept the material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow the divine foot in the door. So, it's not that science forces you to be like this. Scientific method has nothing to do with this particular philosophy. It's just that in order to be part of the club, to be initiated, you have to accept this philosophy in order to be accepted as a member and receive rights of publication. If you try to publish as a creation scientist, you will not publish. That's at least not on this particular topic. I myself, I've published in mainstream science journals, some of the best in the world. I've published 12 papers independently on my own, but not on evolution. I've published in mythology and medicine. But when it comes to trying to publish on evolution, trying to challenge evolution, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible.
Colleagues support your new position. If not,
I'm sorry, before I get into this, let me just tell you, this man who's about to speak here, his name is Dean Kenyon. He wrote, in his early career, he wrote what's known as the Bible for evolutionary thought. It's called Biochemical Predestination, and how he explains how inorganic molecules could assemble themselves into a living thing. And then one of his students one day asked him a question, and he changed his whole outlook, and now he's a creationist.
do many of your colleagues support your new position? If not, why not? Actually, very few have been supportive of my views, new views on origin of life and the development of the species. I think a rather larger number of my faculty colleagues, however, are willing to allow me to express these new views in class. But the majority, though, are unhappy on both counts, I would say. And as to why they hold this view, I don't think there's a simple answer to this. Some of the possibilities are that the Darwinian way of thinking is such a deeply ingrained habit of thought. It's been prevalent for such a long time, and it has so many implications for the whole of biological sciences. Another aspect tied to that, of course, is how graduate students are socialized as they go through their program. You're only Darwinian story of origins. And I think my colleagues, in general, those who are opposed to this, I'm very reluctant to
I don't know. This recording is not coming across the greatest. But basically, just to summarize, he's trying to explain why his colleagues don't understand things the way he does. And he basically says it's because they got trained all the way from grade school, all the way through graduate school. They've only heard one side of the story. They've never considered the other options that are available. And what caused him to change his views is one of his students asked him, what's the point of DNA? If you don't need DNA, I'm sorry? Someone said something. If you don't need DNA to self-assemble, why is it there? Can you all hear it?
It's still difficult.
It's still difficult? Try the other. Can you? Is this one working? Testing. All right, is that working? Can you hear okay? Okay, is that better? Okay. So it's basically, he asked him what's the point of DNA, and he couldn't figure it out. What's that?
Put it on the stand, because you can drop it.
And pull the stand over and throw your mouth.
Can you hear it like this? I'd rather hold it if it's okay. That my angle way down. All right. We'll get it. By tomorrow, it'll be perfect. All right. So Dean Kenyon considered this question, and he couldn't solve it. And it frustrated him for about 5 years, and finally he just changed his mind and gave up. And he said, there must be a creator.
Details of biochemistry, molecular biology might find a signature of some sort of design. Wait a second. Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit. And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe. But you're crazy to say it's God. Heavy. Yes, you can say it's anything you want, matter, space, Martian, anything you want, but not God. Cannot be God. Right? Not allowed to be God. Right?
Did y'all hear that? Richard Dawkins said it's fine to have human life and all life on this planet be created as long as you don't call it God. Right? He's fine with the higher intelligent or intelligent design as long, if there's evidence that comes up for that. He just doesn't like the idea that it might be God, which to me is a very religious, philosophical idea.
They are so close-minded, and it really, I have to say from listening, that it's really not about science. It's anti-God. They cannot allow God to be a part of anything. Right, because if there's a God, then they might be judged. If there's a God holds you accountable for your actions, you're in a lot of trouble. Now, I'm a big person, I'm in a lot of trouble too. But there's a lot, but they cannot, there's a possibility of sin or a possibility of morality, and they can't agree on this basic thing. If man is just a speck of dust struck by lightning and then turned into a human being, then he has no moral responsibility. If we're all children of God, we have some moral responsibility because we all have some little piece of God in us. That scares them to death.
Did y'all hear that? You know, they say, this is Ben Stein. Do y'all know who Ben Stein is? Ben Stein is a Hollywood actor, writer for Nixon and Ford, a speechwriter for Nixon and Ford. He's a very intelligent man. And he came up with a movie here, just released a few weeks ago, called Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. And in this movie, he explains the philosophical basis behind Darwinian thinking, and also the hold of mainstream science upon the media, and also upon mainstream literature, and the philosophical basis behind it. He says you just can't call it God because people are scared that if you start believing in God or saying there's scientific evidence for God, that by implication you have moral responsibility, and no one wants moral responsibility for their actions. Whereas if you're free of moral responsibility, you can do whatever you want without a conscience, a guilty conscience. Which is, to me, I never thought I'd hear this on mainstream TV. Glenn Beck, I guess, is pretty conservative. But. Question. If at least a few well-respected scientists in just about every major field of science, to include Nobel laureates, have problems with some fundamental aspect of naturalism or Darwinian evolution, are these theories really all that well understood scientifically, or are they more religiously or philosophically based and motivated? Here's just a kind of an illustration of bias. A lot of people think, evolutionists are just biased. Well, the problem is that so are we. No one can avoid bias. The best I think we can do is be aware of it. We're all biased to one degree or another by our background, by our experiences, which may make us miss some key aspect of the truth. So, in our search for truth, we should at least be aware of our background, that this background of ours may influence us against the truth. And here's an illustration just from the other side of bias. We humans, we basically discussed that, scientists are not free from this, and neither are theologians or philosophers. For example, around the time of the Scopes and Monkey trial in 1925, was a famous trial of evolution, teaching evolution in Tennessee, Osborne chided Nebraska native William James Bryant. In the press, he wrote, "The earth spoke to Bryant from his own state of Nebraska. The Hesperopithecus tooth is like the still small voice. Its sound is by no means easy to hear. This little tooth that speaks volumes of truth, and that it affords evidence of man's descent from the ape." Okay? And that was at the Scopes Monkey trial. They tried to bring this into evidence, but the judge wouldn't allow it. Later on, here's a drawing. Here's the Nebraska man and his beautiful wife. And here's all they had to go on to make this drawing, right? So Osborne wrote about this drawing. He says, "Such a drawing or reconstruction would doubtlessly be only a figment of the imagination, of no real scientific value, and undoubtedly inaccurate." But we just heard him say this tooth was evidence of man's descent from the ape, right? So how inaccurate is this tooth? Well, a little bit later, they went around digging in the same area. They found that this tooth belonged to a pig, an extinct pig. It was pretty inaccurate. Here's another example. And just last year, August of 2007, they found this skeleton here of Homo habilis. Now, Homo erectus is supposed to evolve from Homo habilis, but they found now that this skull was in the same layers as Homo erectus. So that threw everything out of whack. They couldn't have evolved from one another because they both were exactly right next to each other. So they write, overall what it paints for human evolution is a chaotic kind of looking evolutionary tree rather than the heroic march that you see in the cartoons and of early ancestors evolving from some intermediate and eventually into us. So now all those little diagrams that you've seen, that's all out of whack, at least when it comes to human evolution. So did that kind of mess them up when it comes to evolutionary theory? Susan Anton of New York University, she worried that anti-evolutionists would use this information to show flaws in the overall theory of evolution. Now, good call. It's like, she writes, "This is not a question of questioning the idea of evolution at all. It is refining some of the specific points." Anton said, "This is a great example of what science does and religion doesn't do. It continues to self-test itself, a self-testing process." Now, if she's right, if religion doesn't self-test itself as we go along, if we learn nothing over time, even our religious experience and growth, we have a problem. I think religion should be a science. We should test our own self and ask us why we believe what we believe over time and be solid in our faith. And if we're not, she's right. Okay? Dr. David Philby, an anthropologist from Harvard, made some very interesting comments as well. This is a little bit a while back, so 1978, but they're very interesting comments nonetheless. He writes, "My reservations concern not so much this book," he's discussing origins, "but the whole subject of methodology of paleoanthropology. The introductory books or book reviews are hardly the place to argue that perhaps generations of students of human evolution, including myself, have been flailing about in the dark, that our database is too sparse, too slippery for it to be able to mold our theories. Rather, the theories are more statements about us and ideology than about the past. Paleoanthropology reveals more about how humans view themselves than it does about how humans came about." but that is heresy. This is also along the same lines. This is somebody completely outside of the field. This guy is just goes around and interviews scientists as a writer for Nova. Mark Davis. He writes, and Nova did a series not too long ago on Neanderthals. And this Mark Davis went around and interviewed scientists all over the world. And this is what he says about this whole experience that he had interviewing scientists. He said, I spoke with many Neanderthal experts in the course of making this film, and I found them all to be intelligent, friendly, well-educated people, dedicated to the highest principles of scientific inquiry. I also got the impression that each one thought the last one I talked to was an idiot, if not actually a Neanderthal. The more people I spoke with, the more confusing it got. Listening to archaeologists and anthropologists talk about their work and their colleagues' work, I heard the same frustrations voiced again and again. People are driven by their preconceptions. They see what they want to see. They find what they are looking for. So if you don't want there to be a God, you'll find evidence for there not being a God. No problem. If you want there to be a God, you'll also find evidence for God. No problem. Now, that also boils down, so is God just a happy, good feeling that we want to be there so we believe in Him? Or is there a little bit of science to it as well? I think there is, as long as you don't just go with your emotions. If you actually consider your higher intellect and what God has showed you through the gift of nature, I think that you can come with solid evidence to believe beyond an emotional belief. So what is science? Because I believe, to be honest, science is the only valid way to search out truth of any kind. Religion, philosophical, natural, whatever. It's some form of the scientific method. And so what is this all-powerful method? The scientific method is really easy. It's basically a simple BS detector, crap detector. It says, basically helps you figure out what's not true versus what might be true. Because you can never actually define what is absolutely true. You can only say what's not true. And that's what scientific methods helps you do. It's some people have different versions, but this is the basic version. So first you make an observation. You use that observation to make falsifiable predictions as to what will happen in the future. You then test the prediction to see if it actually successfully avoids falsification, to see if it actually comes true. If the prediction avoids falsification, the hypothesis gains predictive value. It is more likely that the prediction will continue to be true if it was true in the past. And if the prediction fails, the hypothesis must either be modified completely in favor of a new hypothesis or completely discarded. And the Bible actually has the same method. It says, if what the prophet says comes true, you believe the prophet, right? You test the spirits. If the spirits, what they say doesn't come true, or they don't correspond to the word, then there's no light in them, right? It's a scientific method. Sir Karl Popper, he's one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. He wrote, any hypothesis that does not make falsifiable predictions is not science. Such a hypothesis may be useful or valuable, but cannot be said to be science unless it can be proven wrong, or has the potential to be proven wrong. So why did he come up with this? The reason why he came up with this is because he went to a lecture given by Einstein, and he noticed something interesting about Einstein's theories versus theories like Marx and Freud. Einstein's theories were extremely risky, while Marx and Freud were not, and that they explained too much. In other words, if you said, I was dropped as a child, therefore I hate my mother, right? Something like that. Versus somebody, I was dropped as a child too, and I love my mother. And Freud will say, he could explain it away. Well, your mother may have gave you an extra teething ring or something. And so Einstein or Freud couldn't really be solidly disproved, but Einstein could. Einstein's theories, you could say, if the Mercury doesn't precess at exactly this time next year, then Einstein's wrong. And so Einstein's theories were very falsifiable. And therefore, when they held to be true, they were much more reliable and predictable as far as what would happen again in the future. Well, I predict because Mercury was here last year, that next year Mercury will be right there. And so they're more reliable, they're more useful as scientific theories. So, what's a non-scientific prediction? There are such things. For example, dinosaurs and birds both share lots of features. Therefore, you could make a hypothesis: dinosaurs and birds have a common ancestor, which is believed in mainstream science. The prediction then is a link between dinosaurs and birds will be found sharing additional features like feathered dinosaurs. Is that prediction falsifiable? Can you disprove that prediction? Like, eventually I'm going to find a feathered dinosaur. Can you ever disprove that? This side of eternity? Right? So it's not really falsifiable in practical time. Does that make sense? So is that a scientific theory? No. At least not according to Popper, if you ask somebody like him. Scientific hypothesis. Now I can get really mundane with real scientific hypotheses to explain how easy science is to apply to all kinds of situations. For example, let's say I go to Las Vegas and I see that someone rolls double sixes and I happen to be scratching my nose. Therefore, I predict that every time I scratch my nose, double sixes will be rolled. Is that a prediction? It's a prediction. Is it falsifiable? Yes. Is it a valid scientific hypothesis? Yes. It's a valid scientific hypothesis because as soon as I roll, let's say, a 2 and a 5, is that a double six? No. Is my hypothesis falsified? Yeah. So it's a valid scientific hypothesis. What if I did happen to roll double sixes every time I scratch my nose? Would it gain predictive value? Yes. I might not know why it happened. Maybe somebody in the camera is watching me or playing a trick on me. But every time I scratch my nose, if I roll a double six 100 times in a row, I can become more and more confident that maybe my hypothesis has some value.
And very rich.
And very rich, yeah. So let's see if we can use this idea to see if we can detect God's signature in nature. For example, if God does exist, perhaps he could act in a way that we could detect him as both deliberate and intelligent, if he wanted to be detected. God could be detectable as any other intelligent natural agent is detectable, like anthropology, say, science, all that stuff. But some people argue that that's not faith. In order to believe in God, like God really wants you to consider him, you have to trust and believe him based on faith. But my idea is that blind faith is worthless. I have a different definition of faith. To me, someone's faith or my faith increases when I see greater evidences for God. Okay, so blind faith isn't helpful. It's more like Paul said, faith is based on the evidence of things unseen. All right, you don't have to necessarily see an atom to know that it exists, but you have to see a bunch of other physical things, something else to base your belief on, that you can see and touch and feel. And I think God gives us that kind of evidence as well. So if the basic notions behind naturalism and evolution are true, detecting God as deliberate or intelligent would be difficult. You know, if Dawkins is right, if all these evolutionists or scientists are correct, if God only uses natural law to act that are less than human capabilities, finding God will be very hard. If disinterested, mindless laws of nature can explain everything with overwhelming predictive value, how then can one detect intelligence of any kind, much less God? Some mainstream scientists do claim to be able to detect deliberate artifact when it comes to human or even alien action, which is interesting, but we can't detect God. You know, for example, search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or SETI. Anybody ever heard of that? You know, we're searching for extraterrestrial intelligence outside of this earth. As long as we don't call the Eddie God, we're okay, right? So how do you search for Eddie? Let's just start with that. Seth Sostak, he's the senior astronomer at the SETI Institute. He writes, here's how you do it. Perhaps the extraterrestrials will preface their message, it's a radio message, we're looking for radio waves here, with a string of prime numbers, like 1, 3, 5, 7, etc. Or maybe the first 50 terms of the ever popular Fibonacci series, that's like the number plus the previous 2 numbers, which is often seen in nature, by the way. Well, there's no doubt that such tags would convey intelligence. Okay, so if you see such mathematical tags, intelligence, right? That's what he's saying. As long as it's a radio wave. So here's Charles Thaxton, Bradley Walter, and Robert Olson. They say, why then doesn't the message sequence and DNA molecule constitute prima facie evidence for an intelligent source? After all, DNA information is not just analogous to a message sequence such as a Morse code. It is such a message sequence. So here we have our special mathematical formula, except it's not in radio waves, it's just in DNA. So what's the difference between DNA and radio waves as far as having a complex message sequence? Let me start even more basic than that. You know what these are? Here? These are crop circles, right? They first appeared in England in the 1980s, somewhere about. And at first, some scientists thought that maybe some weird weather pattern made these. Do you think? It's funny that regular people thought that they were aliens that made these, or at least some other human that made these. Scientists first started proposing some weather pattern. Sometimes your preconceived ideas make you kind of illogical, even if you're really smart. Who would believe that a tornado came and made that? Okay. Here's another example. These are all granite rocks. Here's some cubed ones. Here's a round one. Here's ones that look like river rocks. Which of these do you think were designed? How about this one? Yes or no? No. This one? Maybe getting close. What about this one? Yeah, that one? Probably, maybe. This one, nice polished round sphere. This one here? Okay, you're all wrong. They were all designed. These are actually hollow rocks made to look like granite rocks, the natural granite rocks. They're all designed. Okay? But can you say something special about these ones? These might have been designed or might not have been, right? Nature could have done that. These ones had to have been designed. You see the difference? So now, here's an example. Here's a salt crystal. It's a cube too, just like, and here's a pyrite crystal here. Here's a snowflake that's very geometric, just like those crop circles. Were those designed or not? Deliberately. I mean, did God sit down there and chisel each one out? No, He set the natural laws in place that would make these, right? So these are within the realm of natural production. Yet they have the same basic shape as these ones that we know were designed. So what's the difference? The difference is that we know granite, the material of granite, doesn't make cubes naturally. Okay? Or spheres, polished spheres, or anything highly symmetrical where stuff on one side is exactly reproduced on the other side. Whereas we know that water does do that in certain natural environments. We know that water makes geometric crystals, and so does salt, and so does pyrite. And so, does that mean that you can automatically come up to something and say, I know right now if that was designed or not? No. You have to investigate it. You have to study it first in relation to various processes of nature that you can observe it interacting with. Science is heavily involved in detecting design. You can't just walk up to something and know the answer. Same, here's more snowflakes, all kinds of different types of crystals. Here's a barrel-shaped crystal. How about this? The seeds just fell there and they grew like that, right? How do you know that? It's because you know that gardens don't grow like that. You have experience, past experience with French gardens, and you know that takes a lot of work, right? How about this? Designed or not? It's designed, right? Planting your natural garden. Right? How about this? A big hurricane came along and shoved all these trees upside down into this beach. In a nice perfect circle with one big one in the middle. Right? No, that's design, right? How do we know that? We know that because we had experience with trees getting shoved around by tornadoes and stuff, at least from us in the South. In California, they might believe this. How about Stonehenge? Stonehenge designed, or did these rocks just kind of get jumbled that way? Okay. So, what about the mechanism of random mutation and natural selection? That's a natural process. It's real. It does happen. So what about that? Can't these real forces of nature make living things out of DNA and all these organic molecules? These forces of nature can and have produced novel functions. I'm a bit different than a fair number of creationists in that respect, and that you can't go to extremes one way or the other. Evolution works. Darwinian evolution actually makes stuff. It just makes what I call very low-level systems of function. There's a line beyond which it can't go, and you can actually measure it. For example, with the granite cube, can nature make some forms of granite that are kind of cube-like? It can make certain cube shapes, right? So it can go to a certain distance, but can it make a highly symmetrical, polished granite cube? No. So it can go a certain ways and then no farther. Statistically, the odds get less and less exponentially. The same thing happens with random mutation and natural selection. For example, look at the sequence here. Cat to hat to bad to bid to dig to dog. I got from cat to dog by changing one letter at a time, and each word makes sense in English, right? Is that not an evolutionary sequence? It is. What are the odds that I could do that with three-letter words and successfully come up with another reasonable, meaningful three-letter word? Pretty good. The odds are actually 1 in 18. I've got a Scrabble dictionary out. If you do it with two-letter words, the odds are 1 in 7. Even better. Now, what do you think the odds are if, let's say, I double it, let's say I go to 7-letter words? What are the odds of finding another meaningful 7-letter word in the English language system by random mutation? Is it like double? Like, say, it was 1 in 18, so is it not like 1 in 50, you think? No? Anybody want to guess what the odds are? This, 1 in 250,000. The odds are 1 in 250,000 of coming up with a, just not even a beneficial word. Let's say I was talking in a normal conversation, and I needed a beneficial word and a meaningful word. I'm not talking about meaningful and beneficial, just meaningful alone. The odds are 1 in 250,000. Now when you add, okay, now I've got a meaningful word, now it has to be beneficial in a particular situation. The odds even go up higher than that. And that's what you have to do with genetics. For example, in living things, the odds of evolving antibiotic resistance. Anybody hear of antibiotics? Bacteria? You get an infection with bacteria, you want to kill it, you take what? Penicillin? Right? Anybody hear that penicillin these days is just about every bacteria knows about penicillin and says, we don't care about penicillin anymore. We are resistant to penicillin. You know how that happened? Well, how it happened is that the way antibiotics work, the antibiotic comes into the bacteria and it attacks one particular target in the bacteria. And they fit together like a lock and a key. Okay? Okay. They fit together like a lock and a key. So this is antibiotic, this is a bacteria, target, and they fit together. What happens if the bacteria mutates and sticks out a finger? Now the target can't really clamp on to it, right? So, and that's just one letter. That's like changing C to a D. Okay? Bacteria happens to do that, antibiotic cannot attack the bacteria anymore. Is the bacteria resistant? Yeah. Is it a real mutation? Random mutation, natural selection? Yes, it is. And it's a novel function. The bacteria wasn't resistant before, now it is, right? So, is it evolution in action? Yes. Is it a simple mutation? It's just one little character change, boom, it's stuck out a finger and now it can't bind anymore. So that's real evolution in action. And there's lots of examples of that sort of evolution in literature. In fact, all of the examples you'll find in scientific literature are that sort of thing. Every example of something new evolving in literature, scientific literature, involves less than 1,000 characters called amino acids. If you look for an example, it's actually less. The biggest I could find is only a few hundred amino acids. And so I just draw the line at 1,000 because nothing even comes close to 1,000. If you say, show me a system evolving that requires at least 1,000 amino acids working together at the same time, show me an example of evolution doing that. There's not one in all of literature. And I've looked for 10 years. And I've debated people all over the world, scientists all over the world over this. And no one else has found me an example of this either. So what you have is evolution working fine at very low levels. So let's say you need a function that requires only a deletion of a particular character to disrupt something else. Those examples happen all the time. They're very common. Now let's say you need a mutation that gives you a new protein, like a new protein function. Here's an example. Barry Hall in 1983, he got some bacteria called E. coli. He deleted an enzyme in them called lactase. it takes the lactose sugar and degrades it into glucose and galactose so they can use it for energy. And he says, what's going to happen if I delete this enzyme? Are these bacteria going to be able to evolve a brand new enzyme? And so he did this, and he grew them on lactose-enriched media, a nice selective environment. And sure enough, the bacteria evolved a new enzyme that did the lactase function, the same as before. And so he came up with another idea. He's like, I wonder what will happen if I delete the second enzyme. Will they evolve another one? Right? That makes sense. And so he deleted the second enzyme, and they didn't evolve any more lactases. And what happened, he observed them for 40,000 generations, which is more generations than we supposedly took to evolve from apes. And they still didn't evolve. The simple little, and lactase is only about 400 amino acids in size. Only requires 400 amino acids, and it doesn't require them to be very specifically arranged either. Kind of jumbled up 400 amino acids. Not very specific, and they couldn't evolve it in over 40,000 generations. And so he got frustrated, and he says, wait a minute, these bacteria have limited evolutionary potential. And so he's like, so what is it that makes limited evolutionary potential? And I propose to you is that 400 amino acids, 400 characters, is about at the limit of what is evolvable statistically in nature. You go a little bit beyond that, nothing evolves beyond that. And you get to 1,000, suddenly you're into the trillions of years of average time that you need. Not just 2 billion, remember the 2 billion at the beginning? Statistically, it's trillions and trillions of years just to evolve simple proteins that work by themselves. So another point I have to make before I kind of conclude here is that every living thing has machines in it. Every living thing, even single-cell organisms, bacteria, every cell in your body has systems that require tens of thousands of amino acids working together at the same time. Tens of thousands, just for one system. And I'll show you a picture of one of these here shortly. So it's kind of like a spectrum. Here you can have deliberate and non-deliberate processes making stuff. Can I make stuff that nature can make? Like amorphous rocks? Yeah, right? Nature can make that too. Okay? So then you kind of move on out. Is there stuff I can make that nature can't make? Right? Like highly symmetrical polished band cubes. I can do that. Nature can't. And so there's a spectrum. And is there a nice clear dividing line? No, it's kind of more of an exponential decay curve. You know, you don't know for sure. Once you get out here, you can say, nature may be able to do that maybe 90% of the time, 90 to 10%. And get a little farther out, the odds are much less. But then you get way out here, and now you're down to, the odds of nature doing that this side of a gazillion years is like 1 in a gazillion. I don't know, right? And so then you say, well, even though I don't know for sure, I can be really confident that nature can't do that. And so then you go over to the design hypothesis. Here's a movie of a bacterial flagellum, and there's E. coli. This is a machine that makes it swim. First, the bacteria builds this little apparatus here, this circular ring, and then another one underneath to hold it onto the membrane here. And then it builds the outside of the motor, and then it sends up this little central drive, and then that little drive makes the little cap. Then these are hydrogen pumps on the outside. And as it bores through the wall, as soon as it gets through, then it starts spinning. If it started spinning beforehand, it would blow apart. Then this little cap starts making different sections of the flagellum, and it has to make them in exactly the right order, or else it wouldn't work. Then it goes off, and then another cap comes on, a different kind of cap, to make the next section of the flagellum. And this little cap, it folds the proteins as they come up the hollow tube, one by one, and it does them very fast. This is slowed down so that you can actually see it happen. But it does this at 50,000 cycles a second. And then it starts spinning and it makes these. If you just don't have the cap by itself, the flagellum won't be made. There's some bacteria that have everything else but no cap, and they can't swim. This flagellar apparatus is called a flagellar motor. It requires at least 10,000 codons of DNA, 10,000 amino acids that are specifically coded for. Nothing like this, no step, none of the individual proposed evolutionary steps for this structure has ever been shown to evolve in real time. They were just hypotheses, just so stories. This happened, and then that just popped into existence, and then that popped into existence. But none of these, no apparatus like this or anything of even close or equivalent complexity has ever been shown to evolve. So, is this not the signature of God? Science allows us to study various materials to determine their natural abilities, and therefore allows us to determine the unnatural activity or manipulation to the point of recognizing the miraculous, even the very signature of God. Christ made the same statement. He says, at least believe the evidence of the miracles themselves if you don't believe my words. The miracles I do in my Father's name speak for me. So, let me ask you a question. Is a simple polished granite cube miraculous? Some people will say, no, that's just a little cheesy cube. Right? Is it miraculous? If I made it, would that be a miracle? If I made a cube, would that be a kind of a miracle? No, most people would say no. But what if nature made it? Would that be a miracle? Yeah, it's miraculous from a certain perspective. What if I raised somebody from the dead? Would that be a miracle? Yes, because from my perspective, I can't do that with my natural abilities. Does that make sense? And so from the perspective of a tornado, some things are very miraculous, like granite cubes. And so you can't use a tornado to explain polished granite cubes. You also can't use a tornado to explain bacterial flagellum. And you can't use random mutation and natural selection either. Just an interesting, one of my favorite quotes from Romans. From since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. In short, true science does not allow one to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Also, religion can be scientific or science-based. There need be no fundamental difference between science and religion. Okay, this is my website if anybody wants to write it down. I have all this stuff, the presentations and everything on detectingdesign.com, as well as about 5,000 other pages of information. Is there any questions? Somebody might have. Somebody has to have some question, because this is my favorite part. Yeah.
I applaud you on some extremely careful work. I think you've done a marvelous job. You obviously have a passion for this, and I just encourage you to keep on and communicate as much as you can. And from my own research, I'm a retired cell biologist, and I work in pathology like you do now. And I have been making a study of my own on science and faith. And one of my passions is to research scientists who hold an authentic Christian worldview and could be recognized by anybody as making a major contribution. And I've uncovered at least 50 from AD 490 into the present time. And I'm about ready to add 12 more. And that's just a discovery to reinforce that the idea that scientists are not believers is not true.
Yes, that's true. There are lots of scientists that are believers, that are even young earth creationists, mainstream Adventists. There's a lot of scientists who claim to be Christian or Adventists too, that I have a hard time understanding how they can be. But there's scientists who are well respected in their field on the whole spectrum. So,
without having known everything that's ever been made, how can we use irreducible complexity to do away with Darwinism? How do do that?
Michael Behe is the first one who coined the term irreducible complexity. I think it's a very good idea, except I think Behe has a little bit of a limitation that he doesn't go far enough with the idea. Behe says that there's some molecular machines that are too complicated to have evolved because you have to have all the parts there at the same time, and natural selection can't do that. Random mutation, natural selection can't get you all the parts there at the same time. Where I think Behe has a problem is that he says that only certain kinds of molecular machines are irreducibly complex. I would argue that everything is irreducibly complex. It's just that, and I would also argue that random mutation and natural selection can indeed evolve irreducibly complex machines, which is a limitation when you're arguing with evolutionists, because they can actually show you examples of evolution in action actually producing irreducibly complex machines. I mean, if you take one part away from a lactase system, there won't be a lactase anymore. Yet we know that it evolves in real time. And so therefore they say, aha, Behe is wrong, completely wrong. Right? And what I would say is that no, Behe is just not complete. What happens is that low-level systems, low-level irreducible systems can evolve. But as you move higher and higher levels, where you require more and more and more parts, evolutionary progress stalls exponentially. You see what I'm saying? And so I think Behe's argument is a good one. He just hasn't taken it far enough. Yes.
The speaker in the room this morning made the statement that many Christian preachers no longer believe in creation. We say, why don't scientists? Well, a lot of religious leaders no longer believe in creation either. It's not that they maybe believe in evolution, but they don't believe in creation.
Yeah. I went to school at Loma Linda University, and as much as I like the school and the environment out there, it's like an Adventist Mecca out there, and I met my wife there. So it's a good place, but it also has some things that are quite shocking to me. La Sierra University as well had an experience there. There are teachers, in fact, there's the majority, I would say, the significant majority, let's say 90% of the teachers at Loma Linda that teach science in the science departments and at La Sierra do not believe in young life on Earth. They believe in some form of Darwinian evolution acting over millions and millions of years. And in fact, some of the teachers teach this to the active exclusion of any sort of Adventist theology in their classroom. They will not allow it to be discussed in their classroom. And I was actually asked last year to speak at La Sierra by the student body because the teachers wouldn't allow me to come to their classroom or anybody else who believed in creation. So yeah, it's a problem and it's getting bigger. It's a bigger, in fact, anybody here at Adventist Today, the Journal Adventist Today? One of the chief editors of Adventist Today doesn't even believe in God at all. He doesn't believe, he's an agnostic. He doesn't really know, he doesn't see any evidence, let's put it that way, for the existence of God. And he publicly admitted this on stage at Loma Linda University Science Conference. And our vice president from the General Conference was there on stage with him. And the GCBP didn't say anything about it. And no one really said anything about it from the audience. So it's an issue, and it's becoming a bigger issue. And many people have left their faith over this, including members of my own family. So, yes?
Side of the coin of that, have you read Gary Swartz's God Experiments? His PhD from Harvard Yale. And he, of course, went through the schooling and the discipline there and evolution. His whole bias and slant was in that direction, but it did not add up in his mind as a mathematician, as an engineer, and a scientist. And he goes through his book how he progressively worked out where he due to his own conscious and his skills in the scientific method, including randomness, which he deals with in his book. He said that he is convinced that there is definitely a God. He even gets into having a personal God. So he came out of that type of milieu to go down the direction you're suggesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of examples of that. I haven't personally read his book, but there's a lot of scientists who have done that, coming out from completely mainstream training, from evolutionary thinking, and have come all the way to personal God, and even Christianity, Seventh-day Adventism. Walter Veit is a famous example. He started out Catholic, then went atheist, and now is an Adventist. All because of the scientific basis for evolution versus creation.
Along that line, what he mentioned and the point you made about the DNA, and how important that is to construct proteins and so forth. Francis Collins, who I'm sure you're aware of, was the director of the Genome Project, which brought about our mapping of the DNA, is a fine Christian and wrote a book called The Language of God. And in that, toward the end, he actually addresses the fundamentalist Christian who believes that the world was created in 24 hours, or 6 days, 24 hours, and he addressed the scientist, the naturalist, and tries to bring them together.
Yes, I think people like Francis Collins and a lot of others like him, even some of the people I've quoted today, have come a long ways just admitting that there has to be a high power. And a lot of people say, well, intelligent design theory is, we should fight against it because it's not really Christian. But to me, it's not true. You have to start somewhere. And intelligent design theory is the first step to recognizing that God is there.
Where are you going to take us this week on our journey?
Well, tomorrow I thought I'd present what I consider in my debates and stuff to be the best arguments I've ever heard from the other side, from those who disagree with me. And then my answers to each of these points that I commonly hear, what I consider very superficially convincing, unless you really think about them. And then the next day I get into the more concrete stuff like fossils and geology. And then the last day, since lots of people, it's the most popular page on my website anyway, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the evidences of early man, the fossil record, and for mankind in general. And because people are just interested in that. So that's what I thought I'd do.
You're going to discuss how DNA transfers information.
Yeah, tomorrow I'll talk. That's the hard part for me, discussing genetics in a simple language as possible, so that most people can understand it. I think it's fairly understandable. It's just that you can't tune out for like a minute and then come back and pick up. You have to concentrate the whole time. I'll just warn you ahead of time. But genetics is where the rubber meets the road when it comes to evolution and understanding it. So it is, I think so. For me, that's the most convincing part of this. Yes, sir.
Is Detecting Design, is that your website?
Yeah, dissectingdesign.com. Yes, sir.
Do you have any of this in book form? I love that you made me see it. I couldn't find it.
I keep telling my wife that I should put it in book form, but a lot of what I like about the website is that you can update it whenever you want. And it's free. And you can put videos on it and stuff, which you can't put in books yet. But eventually, I haven't got a book yet. I told Sigurd, maybe I should just write a pamphlet, because I'd make a lot of money at Kenny. But to be honest, I mean, I'm not doing this for money at all. It's all free on the website. More than you could probably read in several years on the website. And eventually I'd like to put out at least some sort of book format, but it hasn't happened yet.
One other thing, have you seen the film Expelled, and would you recommend it?
I did see it. Ben Stein is the one who's in that, and I had a little clip from him from that movie. I told Sigurd, before I go to Carolina, I've got to see this film because people are going to ask me about this. And it's pretty good for what it was trying to do. He was just trying to make one point, and that's kind of the anti-Christian bias in the scientific mainstream. And for that point, especially him being a Jew, he's a Jew, and from his background, he raised the inflammatory issue of comparing scientists with the Holocaust, with Nazis. And for some people that was very inflammatory, and I understand that. But you have to understand he's a Jew, and there is some parallel here. You take this very personally if your family went through that. And so if you take that part of it with a grain of salt, I think what he did was quite impressive. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. I'll see you all.